My wife cheated, told me she was pregnant with another man's child, then kicked me out of our home. But I rebuilt my life from rock bottom, found real love, and finally learned what it means to be free." Lena's words hit Jake Sullivan like a freight train. "I'm in love with someone else. I'm pregnant. I'm leaving." Portland's evening rain tapped the windows of their Craftsman home, a soft jazz tune curling from the radio, the air thick with the scent of fresh pasta. Jake sat frozen at the dinner table, fork halfway to his mouth, staring at his wife across the scratched oak surface. Lena's face was calm, almost detached, her green eyes steady as she delivered the blow that shattered his world. 10 years of marriage gone in a single breath. "You're what?" His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in. "I didn't plan this," she said, folding her napkin with precision. "But it's happening. I've already packed a bag. I'm staying with him tonight." Jake's mind scrambled for traction. Him. There was a him. A stranger who'd stolen his life. His stomach churned, the pasta turning to ash in his mouth. "Lena, how long? Who is he?" "It doesn't matter." She stood, smoothing her sweater. "I'll be back tomorrow to sort things out. You should start thinking about where you'll go." "Go?" He blinked, the word foreign. This was their home, the one they'd painted blue, the one with the creaky third stair, the one where they'd planned a future. "You're kicking me out?" Her silence was answer enough. She grabbed her coat, the door clicking shut behind her. Jake sat there, the rain louder now, the jazz mocking him. His chest tightened, a scream trapped behind his ribs. He wanted to chase her, demand answers, but his legs wouldn't move. Instead, he stared at the half-empty wine glass she'd left behind. It felt the first fracture of a life he'd never imagined losing. Shock gave way to a hollow ache. He pushed back from the table, the chair scraping the floor, and wandered the house like a ghost. Her scarf still hung by the door, her art supplies cluttered the corner. Everywhere, pieces of them, taunted him. He stopped at the framed photo on the mantel, their wedding day, her laugh in his arms, him grinning like he'd won the world. His fingers brushed the glass, and something broke inside. He sank onto the couch, the weight of her words looping in his head. Pregnant, someone else, leaving, each syllable a blade. Sleep wouldn't come, not tonight, maybe not ever. All he could do was sit there, rain-soaked city light blurring through the window, and wonder how the hell he'd missed the moment his life started slipping away. Jake Sullivan's world didn't just crack, it crumbled. Lena's words, "I'm in love with someone else, I'm pregnant, I'm leaving," played on a merciless loop as he sat on the couch, the Portland rain drumming harder now, like it knew his life was washing away. The jazz station had faded to static sometime after midnight, but he didn't care enough to turn it off. He tried to anchor himself with memories of better days. The summer they backpacked through the Cascades, Lena's laughter echoing as they tripped over roots, her hair catching the sunlight. The winter they renovated this house, paint-splattered and giddy, arguing over whether the kitchen should be sage or slate. Late nights when he coded in the glow of his laptop while she painted across the room, her brush strokes steady, their silence comfortable. Those moments felt like another life now, one he'd been too busy to notice slipping away. Her indifference stung worse than the betrayal. She'd sat there, folding her napkin, voice flat, like she was canceling a subscription. Not a flicker of regret. Jake stumbled through the house. Each room a landmine, the dining table where they'd hosted friends, the bedroom where they'd whispered dreams, her easel in the corner, half-finished canvas mocking him. He wanted to smash it, to scream, but all he could do was grip the counter, knuckles white, and try to breathe. "She wants me out," he muttered to the empty kitchen. "In a week. 7 days to erase a decade." He couldn't wrap his head around it. Who was this guy? How long had she been lying? The questions clawed at him, but her absence left no answers. Just a void where his life used to be. Sleep was a lost cause. He stayed on the couch, the throw blanket smelling faintly of her perfume, a cruel reminder. His phone buzzed. His brother, then Eli, his best friend, but he let it go to voicemail. What could he say? "My wife's gone and I'm too broken to care." Food was out of the question, his stomach rejected the thought. Instead, he stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks he'd never noticed as the hours bled into dawn. By morning, the shock had dulled into a heavy ache. He wandered to the window, watching the city wake up, strangers going about their lives, while his stood still. Lena would be back today, she'd said, to sort things out. Whatever that meant. Jake didn't know if he wanted to fight or beg or just walk away. All he knew was the man he'd been yesterday, the one who thought he had a home, a future, was gone, and he had no idea who was left. Jake Sullivan's new home was a 400-square-foot studio downtown, a sterile box that smelled of stale carpet and regret. He dropped his duffel bag on the floor, the thud echoing in the empty space. Plastic blinds hung crooked over a single window, slicing the gray Portland light into slivers. A chipped table, a lone chair, and a humming refrigerator were his only company. No creaky third stair, no blue walls, no Lena. Just silence, sharp and unfamiliar. He'd left their house a week after her bombshell, her deadline met with movers and a lawyer's cold email. She'd kept the house, claiming it was best for the baby. Jake didn't fight it, couldn't. The fight in him had drained away somewhere between her goodbye and the first sleepless night. Now, standing in this apartment, he felt like a man unmoored, a stranger in his own life. The first night, he lay on a mattress that creaked with every shift, staring at the ceiling's water stains. He missed their Sunday breakfasts, pancakes with too much syrup, her teasing him for reading code at the table. He missed the rhythm of their life, the small certainties. Now, even brewing coffee felt pointless without her humming in the background. His phone buzzed relentlessly. His brother, leaving voicemails about checking in. Eli, texting dumb memes to coax a reply. Jake ignored them all. Talking meant admitting this was real, and he wasn't ready for that. Instead, he unpacked what little he'd brought. Clothes, a laptop, a dog-eared sci-fi novel, and tried to make the space feel like his. It didn't work. The walls stayed bare, the air heavy with absence. Work was his only tether. He dragged himself to the office, a glass-walled tech hub where he architected software no one would ever thank him for. He coded on autopilot, lines blurring as his mind replayed Lena's words. Pregnant. Someone else. His team noticed the bags under his eyes, the missed deadlines, but they didn't pry. Jake was grateful for that, even if it meant drowning alone. By 6 p.m. the office emptied and he'd linger, staring at his screen, because going back to that studio felt like surrender. And he tried filling the hours. Takeout pizza, scrolling X, half watching a basketball game. Nothing stuck. The city outside buzzed, food carts, bike couriers, laughter from bars. But it felt like another planet. One night, he walked to the riverfront, hoping the water's churn might clear his head. It didn't. He just saw their old life everywhere, the bridge they'd crossed on their first date, the skyline they'd admired from their porch. He turned back, hands in his pockets, the weight of emptiness heavier than ever. Jake Sullivan bought a cheap notebook from a corner store, its cover flimsy and blue, and started writing to keep from losing his mind. The studio apartment's humround, the imperious distant traffic, pressed in, and he needed something to ground him. Pen in hand, he sat at the wobbly table, scribbling questions that had no answers. Why didn't I see it? Was it my fault? The words spilled out, raw, jagged, like shards of the life he'd lost. He traced back to the months before Lena's confession. He'd been buried in work, chasing deadlines, architecting systems for a startup that chewed through his nights. Deliverables, product launches, bug fixes, they'd consumed him. He remembered Lena's voice, soft at first, asking him to step away from the laptop. Just one dinner, Jake. He'd nod, promise soon, and keep coding. Soon never came. Date nights fizzled. Her paintings piled up, untouched by his praise. She'd stopped asking, and he'd stopped noticing. The red flags were there, subtle but sharp now in hindsight. Her late nights with friends he never met, her phone always face down. The way she'd flinch when he touched her, a reflex she'd brush off with a smile. Jake's pen paused, his chest tight. He'd been absent, sure, but he hadn't cheated, he hadn't lied. The betrayal was her choice, not his. Still, guilt gnawed. He wrote about their last good day, a random Sunday last spring. They'd driven to the coast, walked the beach, her hand warm in his. She'd laughed when a wave soaked his shoes and he'd kissed her, salt on her lips. That memory stung most, because it felt like proof he hadn't imagined their love. But it also made him question everything. Was she already slipping away then? Was that stranger already in her thoughts? By the third night of journaling, his handwriting steadier, Jake felt a flicker of clarity. He wasn't blameless enough. He'd let work eclipse her. But he hadn't deserved the knife she'd driven in. The notebook became his confessor, catching his anger, his grief, his slow untangling of truth. He wasn't ready to forgive, not her or himself, but he could see the shape of what went wrong. That was enough to keep the pen moving, to keep him from drowning in the dark. Jake Sullivan found a beat-up acoustic guitar on Craigslist for $50, its strings rusty but still singing. He brought it back to his stark Portland studio, propped it against the lone chair, and plucked a shaky chord. The sound was rough, like his high school band days, but it was something. A pulse in the void. For the first time in weeks, he felt a spark that wasn't pain. He started small, carving out slivers of life to call his own. Mornings, he laced up sneakers and hit the trails of Forest Park, the damp earth synced with his strides, the fog curling around cedars pulling him back to his body. He wasn't fast, but he was moving, and that was enough. Each step dulled the echo of Lena's voice, her betrayal a little quieter in the rustle of leaves. Cooking was harder. His first attempt at dinner, spaghetti with jarred sauce, ended in a smoke alarm in a scorched pan. He laughed, a brittle sound, then tried again the next night. By the third try, he nailed it. Pasta al dente, sauce warmed just right, a pinch of salt like she used to add. He ate at the table, no phone, no noise, just the clink of his fork. It wasn't their kitchen, but it was his meal, and it tasted like progress. One evening, flipping through channels, he landed on a sitcom rerun. A dumb joke about a dog hit him square, and he laughed, really laughed, alone in the dark. The sound startled him, raw and unfamiliar. But it lingered like a friend. He rewatched the episode, chasing that feeling, and caught himself smiling when the credits rolled. Therapy came next, a flyer from a community center leading him to a cramped office with a kind-eyed counselor named Ruth. She didn't push, just asked questions that made him dig. "What do you want, Jake?" she asked in their first session. He didn't know yet, but saying it out loud, "I don't know," felt like lifting a weight. He went weakly, unpacking the guilt, the anger, the man he'd been. Each session chipped away at the fog, leaving him a little clearer, a little stronger. These were tiny victories, fragile as glass, but they stacked up. The guitar chords got smoother, the runs longer, the meals tastier. Jake wasn't whole, not yet, but he was building something, piece by stubborn piece, in a life he was learning to claim. Jake Sullivan's phone buzzed again, Eli's name flashing on the screen. He almost ignored it, like he had for weeks, but something, maybe the guitar's hum still in his fingers, or the faint warmth of last night's pasta, made him pick up. "You alive, man?" Eli's voice was half joke, half worry. Jake managed a weak laugh, and before he could dodge, Eli said, "Dinner. Our place. Camilla's cooking, no excuses." Jake didn't have the strength to argue. Their house was a cozy split level in southeast Portland, porch lights glowing through the drizzle. Camilla opened the door, her smile wide, no trace of pity. "Get in here," she said, pulling him into a hug that smelled of garlic and rosemary. Eli clapped his shoulder, handed him a beer, and just like that, Jake was back in their orbit. The kitchen table groaned with roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Real food, not takeout. They ate and talked, steering clear of Lena, letting Jake breathe. They didn't push, and that's what broke him open. Over dishes, Eli asked about work, about the guitar, Jake mentioned. Camila shared stories of her graphic design clients, her eyes bright. Jake found himself talking, not much, but enough, about the trails he ran, the sitcom that made him laugh. They listened, nodded, laughed when he did. No judgment, no fixes, just presence. The next weekend, they invited him again. Barbecue this time, burgers sizzling in their backyard, classic rock on a portable speaker. A few of their friends showed up, easygoing types who didn't know Jake's story. He grilled, cracked a joke about Eli's ancient flip-flops, and felt the group's laughter wrap around him like a tether. Later they played cards, Camilla cheating shamelessly, Eli calling her out with a grin. Jake won a round, and for a moment, he was just a guy at a table, not a man unmoored. Camilla caught him on the porch one night, stars faint above the city. "You're more than who she left," she said, her voice still. "You're still you, Jake, don't forget that." The words landed deep, a lifeline he didn't know he needed. He nodded, throat tight, and she squeezed his arm before heading inside. Game nights became regular, then hikes, then beers at a dive bar with a jukebox Eli swore was cursed. Through their eyes, Jake started seeing himself again. Not the failure Lena walked away from, but the guy who could still tell a story, still make people laugh. Eli and Camila didn't fill the void she'd left, but they reminded him he could. And that was enough to keep him coming back. Jake Sullivan knocked over a stack of paperbacks in a cramped Portland bookstore cafe, muttering an apology as he knelt to pick them up. A pair of hands joined him, quick and sure, and he looked up to meet Natalie, a clerk with warm brown eyes and a crooked smile. "No casualties," she said, holding up a dog-eared Vonnegut. "You're safe." Jake laughed, the sound easier than it had been in months. She wore a name tag pinned to a sweater, her dark hair tucked behind one ear. They got to talking, first about the books, then about the cafe's too-bitter coffee. Natalie had a quick wit, tossing out quips about dystopian novels like they were old friends swapping stories. Jake matched her pace, surprising himself, and when she suggested a sci-fi title he hadn't read, he bought it on the spot. "Good choice," she said, ringing him up. "You've got taste." He came back the next week, not just for the book. Natalie was there, wiping down tables, and waved him over. They swapped Spotify playlist over pastries, hers full of indie folk, his leaning toward classic rock. Springsteen, she teased, raising an eyebrow. Bold, but I'll allow it. He grinned, feeling a flicker of something light, something new. They talked about favorite novels, hers dog-eared with notes, his stacked messily by his bed. When she mentioned her part-time gig teaching pottery, her face lit up, hands moving like she was shaping clay mid-air. One rainy afternoon, they ended up at a corner table, a cafe quiet. Jake let slip a piece of his story. Lena, the betrayal, the empty studio. He braced for sympathy, but Natalie just listened, her gaze steady. That's a lot, she said simply, then shared her own scar, a fiancé who'd left her 2 years back, plans unraveled overnight. It doesn't define you, she added, stirring her tea. But it shapes you, you know? Jake nodded, her words settling like truth he'd been circling. They started meeting outside the bookstore, walks along the Willamette, her scarf flapping in the wind, his sneakers damp from puddles. Coffee dates at hole-in-the-wall spots, where they'd debate movie endings or laugh over nothing. Natalie didn't pry, didn't try to fix him. She was grounded, present, her humor a soft anchor. Jake opened up, bit by bit, about therapy, the guitar, the trails he ran. She'd nod, ask questions, share her own stories of rebuilding. With her, he felt seen, not as a man broken, but as one finding his way. One evening under a streetlight's glow, she brushed his hand, her fingers lingering. Jake didn't pull away. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to step forward, not back. Jake Sullivan spotted Lena across the crowded reception hall, her silhouette unmistakable even in the soft glow of fairy lights. A mutual friend's wedding had brought them here, an unexpected collision neither had planned. She stood alone by the dessert table, her dress loose around her frame, her face etched with a tiredness Jake didn't recognize. No ring, no partner by her side, just Lena, looking like she'd carried more than she let on. He could have turned away, slipped into the chatter of guests, but his feet moved before his mind caught up. She saw him approach, her eyes widening for a split second before settling into something guarded. "Jake," she said, her voice thinner than he remembered. "You're here." "Yeah," he said, hands in his pockets to keep them still. "Didn't expect to see you." The air between them was heavy, not with anger but with the weight of all they'd left unsaid. She nodded, glancing at the floor. "You look facky," she said, almost like it surprised her. Her gaze flicked over him, his pressed shirt, the easy way he stood, the absence of the slump she'd last seen. Jake considered her words, the truth of them settling in. "I am," he said, calm and sure. "Took time, but I am. No need for venom, no urge to wound." He meant it, and that felt like its own kind of victory. Lena's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I'm glad," she said, and it sounded sincere if strained. She shifted, clutching her glass a little tighter. I didn't handle things well, I know that." He waited, letting her words hang. Part of him had once craved an apology, an explanation, anything to make sense of her betrayal, but now, standing here, he realized he didn't need it. Her regret, if that's what this was, couldn't change the past. It couldn't undo the nights he'd spent unraveling, the home he'd lost. He'd built something new without her, and that was enough. "I hope you're okay," he said, meaning it more than he expected. Not forgiveness, not exactly, just a wish for her to carry her own weight, like he'd learned to carry his. She nodded, eyes glassy, and murmured a quiet thanks. The band struck up a new song and Jake took it as his cue. "Take care, Lena," he said, stepping back. She didn't stop him, and he didn't look back as he wove through the crowd, the noise of laughter and clinking glasses washing over him. Outside, the night air was cool, Portland's skyline sharp against the dark. Jake exhaled, feeling lighter, like a knot he'd carried for months had finally loosened. Lena was no longer the anchor of his pain. He was free, not because of her, but because of himself. Jake Sullivan sat across from Natalie at a cluttered coffee shop table, scribbling ideas on a napkin that was already stained with espresso. "What if we started something?" she said, her eyes bright, clay smudged on her sleeve from her morning pottery class. "A place for people like us, picking up the pieces." Jake nodded, the spark of her words catching fire. That night, they launched a blog called Pivot Forward, a space to share stories of rebuilding after life's rupture. The blog grew fast, raw posts about heartbreak, job loss, new beginnings, written by them and others who found their way to it. Comments poured in, strangers thanking them for making pain feel less lonely. Jake coded the site, tweaking layouts late into the night while Natalie designed its look, her artist's touch in every font and color. But they wanted more than words online. So they took a leap and founded a nonprofit under the same name, Pivot Forward, to bring real support to their Portland community. Their first workshop was in a borrowed community center room, folding chairs and a flickering projector. Jake taught tech, upskilling, basic coding, resume hacks, drawing on his software architect days. Natalie led sessions on emotional wellness, using art to unpack grief and hope. People showed up: a laid-off mechanic, a woman fresh from divorce, a kid who'd aged out of foster care. They listened, shared. Jake watched a quiet guy in the back type his first Python line, pride flickering in his eyes, and felt something settle in his own chest. They expanded, adding storytelling nights where locals stood at a mic, voices shaking, then steadying as they spoke their truths. Jake and Natalie hosted, their banter easing nerves, their own stories woven in. "I thought I'd lost everything," Jake said once, microphone heavy in his hand. "But I found out you can start again." The room nodded back, strangers bound by resilience. Volunteering at a youth center came next. Jake taught teens to code games, their laughter filling a basement that smelled of old gym mats. Natalie showed them pottery, her wheels spinning as they shaped lumpy bowls, grinning at their messes. One kid, a wiry 15-year-old named Marcus, coded a pixelated spaceship and hugged Jake after, quick and awkward. "Thanks for seeing me," he mumbled. Jake's throat tightened. Pivot forward became their axis, blending Jake's tech grit with Natalie's creative heart. They weren't saving the world, but they were saving moments. Hours, where someone felt less alone, more possible. Jake looked at Natalie one evening, her hair dusted with clay as they packed up after a workshop, and realized this wasn't just purpose. It was home. Jake Sullivan knelt on the damp sand of an Oregon coast beach, fog curling around him like a whisper, and held out a simple silver ring to Natalie. "Marry me," he said, his voice steady despite the waves crashing nearby. Her eyes, wide and bright, caught the dim light as she nodded, laughing through tears, and pulled him into a kiss that tasted of salt and promise. The ring slid onto her finger, a quiet vow born from a life he'd fought to rebuild. Their wedding was small, held in a Portland garden where wildflowers swayed under a June sky. Eli stood as best man, grinning like he'd won a bet. Camilla dabbed her eyes, whispering to guests about Jake's comeback. Natalie walked toward him in a cream dress, her hair loose, her smile anchoring him. They promised to hold each other through storms, to build not just a life but a home. When they kissed, the crowd's cheers felt like the world agreeing. Jake sometimes caught himself marveling at the man he'd become. The Jake of a year ago, shattered, sleepless, staring at a studio apartment's cracked ceiling, felt like a stranger. Therapy, trails, Natalie's laugh, pivot forward. Snow sanded down his edges, not erasing the scars but making them part of something stronger. He wasn't naive anymore. Didn't think love was a shield against pain, but he knew it could be a reason to keep going. 2 years later, Natalie gave birth to their daughter, June, in a hospital room filled with soft light and sharp cries. Jake held her first, her tiny weight grounding him, her eyes already searching. He whispered her name, June, like a prayer, and when he passed her to Natalie, their fingers brushed, a silent promise kept. They brought her home to a house they'd bought together, a fixer-upper with creaky floors and a porch swing. The final scene unfolded at a picnic in Forest Park, sunlight filtering through cedars. Pivot forward volunteers and youth center kids sprawled on blankets. Natalie sat beside him, June babbling in her lap, tugging at grass with chubby hands. Eli tossed a frisbee. Camilla shouted fake outrage when it clipped her lemonade. Laughter rose, warm and messy, and Jake leaned back, taking it in. He thought of the autumn his life had burned down, the winter he'd spent clawing through ash. Now, here was spring, green, alive, his. The autumn of my life gave way to spring, he thought, watching June's tiny fingers curl around Natalie's. And I'm finally home. A year after the picnic, Jake Sullivan stood on the porch of their fixer-upper, the paint still fresh, watching Portland's autumn leaves drift across the lawn. June, now toddling with fierce determination, chased a stray leaf, her giggles cutting through the crisp air. Natalie called from the kitchen, her voice warm. "Dinner's almost ready." "Don't let her eat dirt," Jake laughed, scooping June up, her tiny hands grabbing at his sweater. Inside, the house hummed with life. Pivot Forward had grown, workshops now packed, a second location in the works. Jake coded new features for their site. Natalie led art classes for kids like Marcus, who'd just won a scholarship. They weren't rich, but they were steady, their days woven with purpose and each other. Eli and Camilla dropped by often, their kids turning the backyard into a chaotic playground. Jake caught his reflection in the hall mirror sometimes, seeing a man he liked, grayer at the temples but grounded, whole. Lena was a distant memory, her shadow gone from his heart. He'd heard she'd moved north, started over. He wished her well, but she wasn't his story anymore. At night, after June's bedtime, he and Natalie sat on the swing, her head on his shoulder. They'd talk about small things, tomorrow's plans, a new recipe, or nothing at all. The quiet enough Jake thought back to the rain-soaked night he'd lost everything. How spring had seemed impossible. Yet here it was, blooming in every laugh, every touch, every dream they'd built together. He held Natalie's hand, June's soft snores drifting through the monitor, and knew this was his life now, rebuilt, not perfect, but true. "I'm home," he whispered to himself, the words no longer a hope but a fact. Jake Sullivan stood in the community center's basement, staring at a water-stained ceiling where a pipe had burst overnight. The pivot-forward workshop space, chairs, laptops, Natalie's pottery wheels, was a soggy mess, the air thick with mildew. "This is bad," Natalie said beside him, her voice tight but steady, her boots squelching on the soaked carpet. June was with Camilla for the day, leaving them free to face this disaster. But Jake felt the weight of it settle in his chest. They'd poured everything into Pivot Forward, savings, sleepless nights, faith. Last month, they'd celebrated a grant to expand, dreaming of a mobile tech lab, more youth programs. Now, the center's director had called with bad news. Repairs would take months, and their lease was at risk unless they could cover costs the grant didn't touch. "We're not insured for this," Jake said, running a hand through his hair. "What do we do?" Natalie crouched, salvaging a clay bowl one of her students had made. "We pivot," she said, her eyes meeting his. "Like we always have." Her resolve sparked something in him, a reminder of why they worked. Her fire, his grit, their shared stubbornness. They started small, rallying volunteers over coffee and ex-posts. Eli showed up with a shop vac, Camilla with sandwiches and a spreadsheet of local donors. Marcus, now 16 and a coding whiz, brought his youth center crew to haul ruined gear. By dusk, the basement was cleared, but the bigger fight loomed, saving their space network. Cold calling old colleagues for sponsorship, Natalie pitched to art collectives, her voice fierce on Zoom calls. They weren't begging, they were building, proving Pivot Forward was worth saving. One night, exhausted on their porch swing, Natalie leaned into him. "What if we lose it?" she asked, her guard down. Jake thought of his old life crumbling, how he'd clawed back from nothing. "We won't," he said, "not alone." He kissed her forehead and they sat in silence, June's baby monitor crackling softly. The breakthrough came at a town hall. Jake and Natalie presented their case, data on job placements, stories of kids like Marcus, photos of pottery and code coming to life. The crowd, packed with faces they'd taught or fed or laughed with, stood and clapped. A local brewery offered to host a fundraiser. A tech firm pledged laptops. By month's end, they'd raised enough to cover repairs and secure the lease. The reopened space felt different, brighter, louder, theirs. At the first workshop back, Jake watched Natalie guide a shy teen's hands on a clay wheel while he helped Marcus debug a game. June toddled in waving a plastic spoon, and the room laughed. Jake caught Natalie's eye across the chaos, her smile saying what words didn't need to. They'd made it. Later, driving home under a pink dusk, Jake realized this scare hadn't just saved Pivot Forward. It had shown him what they'd built wasn't fragile. It was roots, deep and tangled, holding them all. "I love you," he told Natalie, his hand on hers. She squeezed back. "I know. Now keep driving, Sullivan." And he did, toward a horizon that felt like home.